for coming to my talk. Today, I'm going to be discussing how a mother's early experienced maltreatment may increase her vulnerability to COVID-19 related stressors, which in turn can increase the risk for child abuse and compromise the children's mental health. According to the CDC, hospitalizations for abuse of children under 18 in the United States increased during COVID-19. From 2.1% in January 2019 to 3.2% in September 2020. The number of COVID-19 related stressors mothers experienced during April and May in 2020 was related to an increase in child abuse risk. To further understand why child abuse risk increased during COVID-19, we addressed two questions. Does a mother's history of trauma increase her vulnerability to specific COVID-19 related stressors? And does mother's stress due to specific COVID-19 related concerns in April and May 2020 increase the risk of child abuse and poor child adjustment over time? The stress experienced during COVID-19, we looked at 6 types of stressors: financial concerns, food insecurity, lack of childcare, family health concerns, isolation and partner conflict, and the uncertainty surrounding this pandemic. Unemployment has been linked to child maltreatment. And as you can see, this graph illustrates the employment rates since the recession in 2008. And you can see that employment steadily increased until 2020, when there was a sharp decline when the pandemic hit. Mothers are very concerned about whether their children will have enough food to eat. This graph illustrates food sufficiency for families with and without children. The solid line indicates families with children, and the dotted line is families without children. And you can see the middle graph illustrates that mothers who had children were more worried about whether their children were going to have enough to eat. And the top lines show that mothers, although they might say their child might have enough to eat, they're concerned about whether it would be really the right kind of food, whether it's healthy food. By early April of 2020, 16 states had mandated the closure of child care centers, and another 20 states implemented restrictions on the number of children who could be in a classroom. Usually they restricted it to no more than 10 kids. And this meant that mothers really didn't have as much help with childcare as they had before. As more people became infected, mothers not only had to worry about loss of loved ones and actually whether they would even be okay, but they also had to be caring for their ill family relatives while still having to take care of their young children and without a lack of childcare help. Self-imposed and government-mandated social distancing measures meant that more people were staying home and feeling more isolated, and isolation has been linked to child maltreatment, and there was also an increase in the divorce rates, 57% increase between March 25th and April 13th. Overwhelming uncertainty surrounding the pandemic made this time particularly challenging for everyone. It wasn't clear when we would find a cure and whether or not people would be safe and whether or not they'd become sick. Little research has been done to examine how a mother's history of trauma might influence how she manages the stresses of COVID-19. And early trauma has long-lasting biopsychosocial consequences, increasing reactivity to adverse experiences throughout life. The stress response system, cortisol, remains elevated for prolonged periods of time, causing dysregulation in the HPA axis and lowering thresholds to stress. Thus, the trauma of COVID-19 does not stand alone. It can layer on top of prior trauma. So the first question that we were asking is, did mothers' memories of early trauma increase their vulnerability to specific COVID-19 related stress? We expected that mothers who had emotional and physical abuse would be more likely to experience stress due to relationship difficulties. Having more difficulty trusting others, they might find it more difficult when there was stress to rely on their partners and feel more isolated and have more conflict with their partner and feel that they had less help with childcare and be more anxious about the uncertainty surrounding the pandemic. We expected emotional and physical neglect to be related to more stress stemming from concerns about whether their physical needs were going to get met and having to care for sick relatives. So they would score higher on financial concerns and stress due to food insecurity and stress due to family health concerns, whether somebody would die and whether they'd be having to take care of ill relatives. We also examined whether mother's stress stemming from specific COVID-19 related concerns would increase child abuse risk and compromise children's mental health. And we anticipated that it would, and that the stressors identified early on, April, May, that level of stress would be predictive 9 months later of risk for child abuse and children's mental health. We recruited a sample of 298 mothers with children under 3 from Prolific, a third-party research firm. The mothers, ZU did a nice job describing the sample, so I'm going to be brief. The mothers were 19 to 46 years of age. The children were 1 to 28 months old. It's mostly socioeconomic background was mostly middle class with 35% at or below poverty level, and the sample was mostly white. Mothers were visited 3 times over 9 months. Wave 1 began April 10th, Wave 2 began August 8th, and Wave 3 began November 27th. And we retained 83% of the sample. And the data that I'll be presenting today is from Waves 1 and 3. So during the first wave, when most of the states were locked down, mothers completed the Child Trauma Questionnaire short form, which is a retrospective self-report measure to assess negative childhood experiences. And there are 4 scales: emotional abuse. Example item is people in my family called me stupid, lazy, or ugly. Another physical abuse. An item is people in my family hit me so hard that it left me with bruises or marks. Emotional neglect. I felt that someone in my family hated me. And physical neglect. My parents were too drunk or high to take care of the family. Mothers also completed a measure of child temperament, the infant behavior questionnaire. And they also completed the stress experience during COVID-19 measure developed for this study with 6 scales: uncertainty surrounding the pandemic. Will it be okay to go outside? Will I get sick? Is it safe? Lack of adequate childcare, isolation and conflict and fights with partners, family health concerns, having relatives die of the coronavirus, and becoming ill and having to take care of ill family members, and financial concerns. Can I pay the rent? Will I get evicted? And food insecurity. Will my child have enough to eat? And is it really healthy food? And at 9 months later, beginning November 27th, they completed the brief child abuse potential inventory, which assesses risk of perpetrating acts of abuse. And this measure is validated with reports of abuse from child protection agencies. And example items are: my family fights a lot, children should never disobey, and a child needs very strict rules. Mothers also completed the child behavior checklist, which is 99 items to assess emotional behavior problems in young children. We use the internalizing problems and externalizing problems scales. Internalizing assesses depression, anxiety, and somatic symptoms, and externalizing assesses aggression and rule breaking. And what we found is that mothers' emotional abuse, but not physical abuse, predicted to relationship difficulties, uncertainty surrounding the pandemic, lack of childcare, isolation, and partner conflict, experiencing less trust. Maybe from having been emotionally abused, it's more difficult for them to enter or manage relationships, and they will have more anxiety about how long the pandemic is going to last. The physical abuse was not related, which we did not predict but it does fit with findings from the Minnesota Longitudinal Study, which shows that children who experience more emotional abuse, or emotional and physical abuse, but those who experienced emotional abuse actually fared worse in social relationships than those who were physically abused, though neither type of abuse was good for the children. Physical neglect, as predicted, was more related to mothers' concerns about whether their physical needs would be met. There was an increase in stress due to food insecurity, financial concerns, and family health concerns, taking care of relatives. But there was also an increase in isolation and partner conflict. And interestingly enough, emotional neglect did not predict, and we suspect it's because people who grew up and were ignored and left out, maybe being in the pandemic where they didn't have to worry about being left out because there were no parties and there wasn't really anything happening, and they didn't have to be with people they were uncomfortable with, wasn't as difficult for them as those who have been neglected or emotionally abused. And in terms of trying to understand the relationship between COVID stress and its impact on children, we found that isolation and partner conflict and uncertainty surrounding the pandemic predicted the risk for child abuse. So it was these relationship issues and their anxiety about the uncertainty that made them more likely to be at risk for child abuse. And then the child abuse then predicted to internalizing and externalizing problems in the children. In addition, the uncertainty surrounding the pandemic and isolation and partner conflict, as well as financial concerns, predicted more internalizing problems. Again, that type of stress, it might have been more difficult for the parents to be emotionally responsive and involved with the children, and their anxiety might have been felt by the children, so the children felt more anxious and more depressed. On the other hand, uncertainty during the pandemic and lack of childcare also predicted to externalizing problems. So the summary of findings is that emotional abuse is related to COVID-19 related stress stemming from relationship difficulties, including isolation, conflict with the partner, and lack of help with childcare. And physical neglect was related to COVID-19 related stress regarding having physical needs met, including paying bills, having enough food for their children, as well as conflicts with the partner. And maternal stress due to COVID, due to relationship difficulties and uncertainty surrounding the pandemic, forecast 9 months later child abuse risk and poor mental health outcomes in their children. So in conclusion, to minimize the risk of child abuse and increase children's mental health, it is especially important to help mothers cope with the uncertainty that has surrounded the COVID-19 pandemic and establish or reestablish their social supports. Our next step is to identify the coping strategies that mothers with different abuse histories use to successfully manage stress stemming from the COVID-19 pandemic. And all of this research would not have been possible without my amazing colleagues, Nancy Hazen and Jody Nicholson, and students, Gabriela Aquino, Ashley Aviles, Sarah Klein, Ziyu Tian, Monique Villamore, and Shuzi Zhang. And I have my email at the bottom in case you would like to contact me and talk about this research further. And I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you. Thank you for coming.